She was just 12. 12 years old. Still playing with her stuffed animals. Still writing notes to friends on crumpled notebook paper. Still learning how to braid her hair, how to be brave in the dark, how to fit in at a new school. Shanda Sharer had a giggle that bounced like sunlight off water. She loved cats. She had braces. Her biggest concerns should have been spelling tests and who she might sit next to at lunch. But on a cold January night in 1992, her world and the innocence of an entire community was shattered. Because behind the whispers of high school gossip and the scribbled notes passed in secret, something sinister was growing. Jealousy, rage, a twisted obsession, and 4 teenage girls who made a decision that would end a life and haunt the nation. This isn't a horror movie. This isn't fiction. This is a true story. One of the most brutal crimes ever committed by juveniles in the United States. A 12-year-old girl was abducted, tortured, and burned alive. Not by hardened criminals. Not by strangers. But by girls who laughed, who cried, who once played with dolls themselves. So I ask you, what drives someone to commit such a monstrous act? What goes wrong, so wrong, in the mind of a teenager that they're capable of extinguishing a life so young, so bright, so full of promise? Tonight, we unravel the chilling case of Shanda Sharer. And by the end, you won't just know what happened. You'll feel it. You'll carry it. Because this isn't just a crime story. It's a warning. It's a mirror. And it begins right now. Let's start with the girl at the center of it all. Her name was Shanda Renee Sharer. Born June 6, 1979 in Pineville, Kentucky, Shanda was the kind of child whose smile made people soften. She had that spark, bright, curious, and warm. Her family had recently moved to Indiana, and like any kid her age, she was navigating the choppy waters of middle school, new friendships, and growing up. She spent weekends with her dad in Jeffersonville, and when she wasn't there, she was often curled up with her cat, writing notes to friends or giggling about crushes. She adored music, dance, and the colorful world of childhood. But Shanda was also brave. When she walked into Hazelwood Middle School, new and unfamiliar, she didn't shrink. She tried to fit in, make friends. And like many 12-year-olds, she was figuring out who she was. That journey led her into a budding friendship, perhaps something more, with a classmate named Amanda Heverin. Innocent, curious affection. The kind that should have been nothing more than a footnote in her young life. But this connection would ignite a jealousy so poisonous, it would cost Shanda everything. Enter Melinda Loveless. At 16, Melinda was older, and to many who knew her, already troubled. Her childhood was scarred, tales of violence, emotional neglect, and trauma that etched deep into her psyche. Her relationship with Amanda had been intense, possessive, and when Amanda's attention turned to Shanda, something inside Melinda snapped. She became consumed with rage. And that rage metastasized into something terrifying. Melinda didn't just want Shanda gone. She wanted her destroyed. She wasn't alone. She found company in Lori Tackett, 17, intense, unpredictable. Lori had her own demons. Diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, she was fascinated by the occult. She had a flair for drama and violence. To some, she seemed fearless. To others, dangerous. Then came the younger two, Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence, both just 15. Hope was known to cut herself, a girl fighting a silent war inside. Toni had been abused, damaged, quiet, and easily swayed. Neither of them knew Shanda. Not really, but they were about to become accomplices to something unforgivable. 4 girls, teenagers, friends. And yet what they did that night defies all logic, all empathy, all understanding. It's easy to look at villains and call them monsters. But these weren't monsters from some nightmare. These were teenagers. Ordinary, broken, angry, deadly. And in just a few hours, they would cross a line that would leave a 12-year-old girl begging for mercy, and a nation stunned into silence. Who they were, how they came together, is not just part of the story. It is the story. Because before the crime, there were choices. And before those choices, there were lives filled with pain, confusion, and desperation. But none of it, not the trauma, not the heartache, not the age, can excuse what happened next. Because what they did was evil. And Shanda Sharer was about to pay the price. Madison, Indiana. Winter of 1992. A town that, on the surface, looked like every other quiet Midwestern community. White picket fences. Church bells on Sundays. High school football. A place where neighbors waved and children rode their bikes down sleepy streets without a second thought. But behind the frosted windows and chilly winds, something darker was brewing. Something that would turn this town's name into a headline, etched into history as the site of one of the most senseless crimes America had ever seen. At the heart of it all were 3 girls, and a love triangle that should have been a teenage misunderstanding, but instead exploded into a firestorm of hatred. Shanda Sharer, the new girl at school, quickly struck up a bond with Amanda Heverin. Amanda was charismatic, older, and had recently ended a turbulent relationship with someone known for being possessive, Melinda Loveless. To Shanda, Amanda probably felt exciting, a little rebellious, like an anchor in the middle of a new, confusing school environment. They passed notes. They laughed together. And, as young hearts often do, they explored the blurry space between friendship and something more. But what might have seemed harmless to them was anything but harmless to Melinda. Melinda had loved Amanda in a way that felt all-consuming, obsessive. And when she saw Amanda's attention turning to this bubbly, 12-year-old girl with bright eyes and braces, her obsession turned to fury. And from that fury came a plan. It started small. Threats. Glares. Shanda was warned to stay away. But the warnings turned into hateful letters, explicit, cruel, and terrifying. Amanda, disturbed by the things Melinda wrote, gave those letters to school officials. But nothing was done. No call to Shanda's mother. No school counselor. No real intervention. And so Shanda's family, sensing something wasn't right, made a decision. Pull her out. Enroll her in a different school. A fresh start. But the problem wasn't the school. It was Melinda. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. In Melinda's mind, Shanda hadn't just taken Amanda. She had humiliated her, replaced her, made her invisible. And that kind of rage, the kind that builds slowly, day after day, doesn't fade. It festers. It waits. Until one night, it explodes. But make no mistake, this wasn't a story of high school drama. This was a story of obsession. A story of teenage jealousy twisted into something unrecognizable. A story that would end in horror. Because Melinda wasn't just angry. She wanted revenge. And she was about to bring 3 others along for the ride. January 10th, 1992. A Friday night. The kind of night where most kids might be at a sleepover, or watching TV, or begging their parents for just a few more minutes on the phone. But somewhere in southern Indiana, 4 teenage girls were planning something very different. In a dimly lit room, Melinda Loveless sharpened her fury like a blade. She had already made up her mind. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't to scare Shanda. This was punishment. She held up a large kitchen knife and showed it to the others, Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Tony Lawrence. This, she said coldly, is for her. Now let's take a step back. Hope and Tony were 15. They didn't really know Shanda, but they were wrapped in the thrill of it, the danger, the drama. Lori, older and more twisted, fed off chaos. Melinda, she was the ringleader. Her rage was the engine. And that knife? That was the point of no return. The plan was simple. Lure Shanda out of her dad's house. Convince her Amanda wanted to see her. And then take her somewhere no one would hear her scream. Around 11:30 p.m., Rippey and Lawrence pulled up to the home where Shanda was spending the weekend with her father. They knocked on the door. Shanda answered. What she saw were 2 girls she vaguely recognized, friendly enough, smiling. They told her Amanda wanted to meet up, that she had to come with them, just for a few minutes. Shanda hesitated. She said she wasn't sure, that she'd need to change clothes. She went back inside, took her time. Maybe something inside her sensed this wasn't right. Maybe she was just nervous. But when she returned, she climbed into the car. And just like that, she was gone. The girls drove her deep into the Indiana woods. Their destination, an old stone structure called the Witch's Castle in Utica. Local legend claimed it was haunted. A crumbling building surrounded by darkness and silence. A place teens visited for dares and stories, but never alone. Never like this. When they arrived, Shanda stepped out of the car into the cold night air. Confused, curious, maybe even a little scared. Then everything changed. Melinda emerged from the shadows, dressed in black, face contorted with fury. She confronted Shanda, screamed at her, accused her of stealing Amanda. And before Shanda could even process what was happening, the knife appeared. She was trapped. Terror doesn't always come with screams. Sometimes it arrives in stunned silence, in the sudden realization that the people around you aren't playing, that this isn't a joke, that this night won't end the way it started. Shanda begged. She cried. She asked why, but no answer could make sense of what came next, because this wasn't about logic. It wasn't about fairness. It was about control and cruelty, and Melinda's need to hurt what had hurt her. Shanda Sharer was now completely at their mercy, and they had none to give. Inside the cold, stone walls of the witch's castle, time slowed. The echo of every footstep, every scream, every cruel laugh seemed to hang in the air like mist. This was no longer a teenage prank. This was ritualistic, calculated, sadistic. They forced Shanda up the dark staircase of the crumbling ruin. Her thin jacket no match for the January chill, or the fear coursing through her small body. She didn't fight. Not yet. Not fully. She was in shock, trying to make sense of it, hoping this was all a misunderstanding that would soon be over. It wasn't. They tied her hands with rope, rough, fraying twine that bit into her skin. They taunted her, mocked her voice, her looks, her friendship with Amanda. One of the girls grabbed Shanda's long hair, threatening to cut it off. "You think you're so pretty," one spat. "Let's see how you look bald." They ripped the rings from her fingers, small, delicate pieces of jewelry, likely given to her by family or friends. Innocent symbols of childhood love, now claimed as trophies. Melinda, her eyes burning with rage, shoved Shanda to the ground. She waved the knife in front of her, pressing it to her neck, whispering threats through clenched teeth. She wanted Shanda to feel fear, not just pain, but dread, helplessness. And then came the Mackey watch. Shanda wore it on her wrist, a gift from her father. It was precious to her, familiar, a comfort. So they took it. Melinda strapped it to her own wrist and mocked her with it. "Look at that," she sneered. "I guess it's mine now." The other girls laughed. Loud, hollow laughter that filled the empty castle and bounced off the stone like bullets. Shanda cried out, begging to be let go, to go home. She promised not to tell anyone, promised to leave Amanda alone, promised anything. But this wasn't about promises. It was about power. They weren't just torturing her body. They were unraveling her mind. They made her strip to her underwear. They shoved her around. They took pleasure in her terror. They wanted her broken. And every second they spent in that cursed place, brick by brick, they were dismantling the soul of a 12-year-old girl. A girl who had trusted them, who had believed them, who had stepped into the car thinking it was safe. Now, trapped in the middle of nowhere, she realized the truth. There was no escape, no mercy, only cruelty. And it had just begun. You'd think the nightmare ended at the witch's castle. It didn't. The girls, Melinda, Lori, Hope, and Tony, loaded Shanda's limp, battered body into the trunk of the car. Her clothes soaked in blood, her skin torn, her voice barely a whisper, her tiny frame shoved into darkness, bruised and bloodied. To them, it was over. To Shanda, it wasn't. They drove away, leaving behind the ruins and memories of everything they'd just done. At Lori Tackett's house, they joked. They laughed. They washed the blood from their hands. They bragged. It was 2 a.m., and from outside, in the stillness of the night, came something they didn't expect. A sound. A low, muffled sound. A whimper. She was still alive. She was still crying. She had survived. Not out of strength, Not out of will, out of something deeper, a primal instinct, a fragile hope. Hope that someone would hear her. Someone did, but not the kind soul she needed. Not the mother, not the father, not the police. Lori Tackett opened the trunk, and instead of shock or horror or mercy, she smiled. She pulled Shanda out onto the cold, frozen ground. She taunted her, mocked her sobs, looked her in the eye, and knew that she had survived all they had done to her. So she called Melinda, and Melinda came, with a tire iron in her hands, and she beat Shanda. She beat her over and over, on the head, the chest, the arms, the face. And still, Shanda clung to life. Still, she gasped. So they shoved her back into the trunk. Again. Drove off. Again. But this time, it was different. This wasn't about scaring her anymore, or teaching her a lesson. It wasn't even about Amanda. Not now. This was about erasing her. And as they cruised the back roads of rural Indiana, the girls rolled the windows down, let the cold air whip around them. They played music, laughed, shared stories. Behind them, in the trunk, Shanda Sharer bled. She was still alive, still suffering, still a child. And if you're sitting there struggling to understand how this could happen, how 4 teenage girls could ride through the night with a dying 12-year-old in the back of their car, you're not alone, because there's no explanation that makes sense, no justification, no twisted psychology that can untangle the cruelty of what they did. They weren't monsters in masks. They weren't menacing figures from horror films. They were teenage girls, and they chose this. So now we must ask, how? How could human beings do this? It was nearly dawn when the car pulled into a gas station. Hope Rippey and Lori Tackett got out, acting casual. To the cashier, they looked like any other teenage girls on a strange late-night errand. But in the trunk of their car was a dying child, beaten, broken, barely conscious. They walked into the store, laughing, bought a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi, and when no one was watching, they poured out the soda, filled the bottle with gasoline, and left. Back in the car, Melinda Loveless clutched the makeshift container, her hands steady, her face unreadable. They drove in silence to the edge of a remote field in Jefferson County, a desolate stretch of gravel and weeds at the end of a logging road. The sun had not yet risen. The world was still dark. Shanda Sharer was still alive. She had endured hours of abuse, physical, emotional, psychological. And now, as the car came to a stop one final time, her fate was sealed. They dragged her out of the trunk. Her body could no longer resist. Her voice, if it existed at all, had no sound left. She was wrapped in a tattered blanket, the same one that had once provided warmth in someone's home. Now, it was her funeral shroud. They laid her on the frozen ground. One of the girls poured the gasoline over her body. Shanda didn't scream. She couldn't. Her breath was shallow, her body still, but her heart, it was beating. She was still alive. Melinda struck a match, lit the fire, and stepped back. Flames engulfed Shanda instantly, twisting and cracking in the early morning cold. The light from the fire flickered against the trees. The smell of burning fabric and skin filled the air. It was over in moments, but the echoes would last forever. The girls drove away, the fire fading behind them. They went to McDonald's. They ate breakfast. They joked about the smell of Shanda's burning body still clinging to their clothes. And the world turned unaware until morning broke. Later that day, 2 hunters stumbled upon the blackened remains. At first, they thought it was a mannequin, something discarded. But the truth was far worse. It was a child, a 12-year-old girl, burned beyond recognition, curled in on herself like a broken wing. Her socks the only clothing not consumed by the fire. A small, melted piece of fabric still clinging to her leg. The coroner would later confirm the unspeakable. She was alive when they set her on fire. Let that settle. She was alive. Let the silence hold it. No child should ever die like that. No human being should be capable of it. But it happened. And now we know. Because we must. Because we cannot look away. because to forget would be another kind of crime. The next morning, January 11th, Shanda's father woke with a sinking feeling in his chest. Her bed was empty. He called her name once, then again. Checked the house. Checked outside. The car was still there. Her shoes. Her coat. But no Shanda. Panic set in fast. He called her mother, Jackie, who lived just a few miles away. Her voice cracked the moment she heard the words. "I don't know where she is." Within hours, they were filing a missing persons report. The police were notified. Flyers were being printed. Calls were being made. No one could have imagined what had already happened. That same morning, across the county line, two hunters walked through a quiet field near a gravel logging road. The ground was cold and still damp from the previous night's frost. They weren't looking for anything, just getting some air, until one of them froze mid-step. Lying in the field at the base of a patch of trees was something they couldn't comprehend. A burned, twisted figure, too small to be an adult. At first, they thought it was a mannequin, a prank. Then they saw the melted remnants of a sock, and they realized this was real. They called the police. And when investigators arrived, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The body was unrecognizable, charred nearly beyond recognition. The face, the limbs, scorched. A horror beyond anything they had encountered before. They collected what evidence they could, bagged the remains, began the slow, agonizing process of identifying who this child might have been. Meanwhile, Shanda's family waited. Hours passed, then a day. A mother's worst fear hanging over every phone call. It wasn't long before detectives connected the missing girl from Jeffersonville to the unidentified body in the field. Dental records confirmed what everyone feared. It was Shanda Sharer. Her mother collapsed. Her father stared blankly ahead, trying to process the impossible. A 12-year-old girl, tortured, murdered, burned alive. But the most shocking twist was how fast the case began to unravel. Because someone talked. Toni Lawrence, just 15 years old, walked into a local police station with her parents the very next night. She was shaking, pale, haunted, and she confessed. Every detail, every moment, from the luring to the torture to the fire. She couldn't keep it in anymore. Shortly after, Hope Rippey followed. She too confessed. Gave names, gave times, gave everything. The police were stunned. They didn't expect this case to be solved so quickly, but now they had it all. Within days, Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett were arrested. All four girls were charged with the abduction, torture, and murder of Shanda Sharer. The community was in shock. These weren't hardened criminals. They were teenagers, girls who lived in nearby neighborhoods. Girls who had gone to the same schools. Girls who had laughed in classrooms and stood in cafeteria lines. And now they were cold-blooded killers. The question wasn't how anymore. It was why. But that answer would only get darker. When the last ember of that early January fire finally faded, it left behind a community in ruins and a justice system forced to confront the unthinkable. The question wasn't whether Shanda Sharer had been murdered. That part was undeniable, sickeningly so. The question now was how to hold her killers accountable, when her killers were children themselves. Melinda Loveless, 16. Lori Tackett, 17. Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence, both 15. Not one of them old enough to vote. Not one of them old enough to legally drink. But all of them capable of torture and murder. And so the state made a choice. All four would be tried as adults. This was not some teenage mistake, not mischief gone wrong. This was evil, planned, executed, and remorseless. The kind of cruelty that doesn't just shock, it unsettles the soul. The charges were severe: murder, criminal confinement, aggravated battery, arson. Each girl faced decades, if not life, behind bars. And though the courtroom saw no trial, it was still filled with tension, with grief, with questions that would never have satisfying answers. Because instead of dragging Shanda's family through a prolonged and painful trial, the girls took plea deals. One by one, they stood before the judge and admitted their guilt. There were no cries of innocence, No last-minute confessions of regret. Just cold facts and years exchanged for a life that could never be returned. Melinda Loveless, the mastermind, received 60 years. Lori Tackett, her accomplice in horror, also received 60. Hope Rippey was sentenced to 35 years. Tony Lawrence, who had the least direct involvement and had come forward to confess, received 20. Shanda's family sat through it all. Her mother, crushed. Her father, stone-faced, trying not to collapse under the weight of it. No sentence would ever be long enough. No courtroom verdict would bring back their daughter. But it was something, a sliver of accountability. And perhaps, in those moments, it felt like justice. But time has a way of testing what justice really means. Because eventually, those doors would open again. And one by one, the girls who killed Shanda Sharer would walk free. There is no fixing something like this. No tidy ending. No final chapter where everything makes sense. Because Shanda Sharer should have turned 13. She should have fallen in love for the first time. Graduated high school. Found her passion. Built a life. Instead, she became a headline. A name etched into horror. A symbol of what happens when warning signs are ignored. When rage is allowed to fester unchecked. But her story didn't disappear. Her mother wouldn't let it. Jackie Vaught, broken but not defeated, refused to let Shanda's memory be defined by the brutality of her death. She created a scholarship fund in Shanda's name to help other children, especially those facing hardship, get the chance her daughter never had. Every year, that scholarship is awarded with love and grief folded into every word of its announcement. And then, something extraordinary happened. Years after the trial, Jackie learned that Melinda Loveless, the very girl who had orchestrated her daughter's murder, was participating in a program that trained service dogs for veterans. It was meant as a form of rehabilitation, a second chance. Jackie could have looked away, could have shut the door, could have said no, but she didn't. Instead, she donated a puppy to the program, a tiny, wiggly dog named Angel, and she gave it in Shanda's name, not for Melinda, not for forgiveness, but because she believed that good can grow even from the ugliest soil, that healing is not forgetting, it's remembering and choosing to love anyway. It was an act that stunned the public. Shanda's mother and her killer connected not by peace but by purpose. That doesn't mean the pain is gone. It never will be. But Jackie Vaught chose to build something out of that pain. Something that breathes and walks and wags its tail. Something that serves others. That comforts. That protects. Something her daughter never got the chance to do. And in the end, that's what remains. A life ripped away. Trauma that lived on. A brutality that shocked a generation. And the slow, messy, unimaginable journey toward healing. If this story has both fascinated and horrified you, remember, true crime is far from over. In fact, the next story we're going to explore might be even more shocking. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification button to stay up to date with more real-life stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Remember to leave your comment and thoughts below. The dark truths behind some of the most chilling crimes are just beginning. Stay tuned. The next story is waiting, and it's one that'll send a shiver down your spine. Thanks for watching.